blanks. He was on. He said my audio dropped out too. So
yeah, that might have been me because I was hitting a whole bunch of buttons, and then I got you muted somehow, and I couldn't unmute you. I couldn't hear you. It was just a mess.
Are people still online? Are they?
Yeah, Dana's back.
Thanks,
hopefully
Dana.
The rest will come back too.
Okay.
All right. So I totally missed the answer to Kayla's the comment I made on all that. So I guess we won't reiterate that because everyone else probably did hear it.
Okay.
I wanted to go into. I found that there's a fair amount of stories have a strong cause and effect theme. Most people talk about addiction when they talk about your stories, but I found that there's also a really strong cause and effect theme, like the story Choo Choo. I think that's a great example. Is the reality of dealing with consequences, or dealing with consequences for doing bad decisions, is that something you've had to struggle with in your life?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure everybody has to some degree. I mean, I think some of a story like Choo Choo draws a fair bit from my memories of adolescence and teenage years, just acting out and doing things simply because you know you shouldn't do them. I often return to a line from Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, where he describes this human impulse as, I think he calls it the spirit of perverseness, where we do things simply because we know we shouldn't. So in a sense, you're like either unconsciously or subconsciously aware of that cause and effect relation going in, and yet you do it anyway. So yeah, that's an interesting question, that idea of cause and effect. I read a book called what was the name of it? It's a book by Quentin Meillassoux, where he argues that basically the universe is governed by contingency. So, and I think I subscribe to that notion to some degree. So that also probably finds its way into my fiction. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very good question.
I find that interesting because it seems like a lot of people, maybe it's what you were explaining there, but it seems like a lot of people are just, they don't think before they do, and and stories like this happen. And it's kind of a heartbreaking story. It's one thing that your fiction actually makes me hyper aware of my parenting ability and cause and effect. I'm always preaching cause and effect to my son, and I don't know if I should, but when I read this story, it was the first thing I thought of. I was like, oh God, like if that were to happen to my son, and you know what I'm talking about, that would kill me, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting, this idea of a parent reading my fiction. I'm not a parent. I have a lot of friends who are parents, but Shelter for the Damned deals a lot with parent and child relationships. And that novel, again, I drew a lot on my teenage memories. I wasn't violent in the same way that the protagonist of Shelter for the Damned is, but I was certainly angry, and I certainly felt alienated, and I certainly felt hopeless in a lot of ways. I felt like I was weird, like I didn't fit in, like I didn't see any space for me in the social structures that I existed within. So I acted out. I was suspended, like the protagonist in Shelter for the Damned. I was suspended from school. It was like a cumulative punishment for all these things I did wrong. And I drew a lot on those interactions that I would have with my parents and facilitators in the novel and in other stories. I would often just say, like, I'm sorry, I don't know why I did it. And I didn't really know. During that period of your life, you've got all this hormonal chaos going on, this periodic almost dissociation, this kind of it's like oscillating between numbness and extreme emotion in that junior high era, or I guess middle school era in America. Yeah, so I guess I just pull from memory in terms of those things in my fiction.
Well, Shelter for the Damned is what I was talking about mostly when I said that you make me question my own parenting, because that story really has a lot to do with family relationships, and not everyone comes from a good home. And that really shows some some of the darker sides. I think the main protagonist had a fairly decent home, but his friends did not. And everyone growing up, I think, will experience the same thing. They'll go to their friends and they'll see something that's quite alien to what they're used to when they're at home. And so I found that really interesting, because it made me think of when I was a kid myself. And, and also I'm like, oh God, I hope I'm not, bad to my son.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I don't know if I've talked to any readers who are parents about that specific reaction to the novel. How did you feel as a parent reading Shelter for the Damned? So that's really cool.
How do you feel as a parent, huh?
Yeah, exactly. You feel good about yourself, huh? Yeah.
You doing a good job, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
So I find it interesting that the story you said in Darkest Hours, the one that scared you the most, is probably one of the more quiet ones, and that's Fear and Grace. Aside from that mouse scene, it is pretty quiet. But the reason why this story is so scary is because one of the characters. And I was wondering if you've ever come across somebody like that in your own life.
Yeah, for sure. The character Herbert in Fear and Grace is kind of he's kind of an amalgam of, in a sense, he's a kind of archetype, but an archetype I've seen manifesting in various people or in various behaviors, specifically within academic environments. So I think, probably like a lot of people, when I first entered the academic world, I was impressionable, I was excited, I was nervous, thinking, where do I fit in here? That's a recurring thing for me, this feeling of anxiety, social anxiety, feeling like an outsider. And sometimes you encounter people who maybe you trust more than you should, and then you get a glimpse of something else. And that's happened to me on a few occasions, which, you live and learn. But power relations and abuse of power and psychological manipulation used to egregious ends, all of those things really scare me. So, and the sociopathy of Herbert. Incidentally, the mouse incident in that story is based off of something a kid in my neighborhood told me when I was growing up, and it always haunted me and fucked me up. So that's nominally a true story.
Yeah, that would certainly haunt me, especially if you were like there and saw it. Like,
yeah, traumatizing.
That what you were talking about in your answer to that kind of reminded me of Lucio Schluter. Because that story is pretty fucked up. Well, all these stories are fucked up to one degree or another, right? But this story goes into some really dark territory. And the last time I checked that poll we were talking about, it was like in second place. I don't know if it still is, but yeah, that story is pretty fucked up too. And in the author notes, you mentioned abuse within the academic circles, and I think it's quite well known just how toxic academia can be. So is this something you've personally experienced?
How do I answer this question?
Yeah.
Carefully, tactfully. I'll say to some degree. Yeah. So my stories draw. It's never like an explicit grafting of my experiences onto fiction, but I might pull fragments of memories, fragments of relationships, often in a very abstracted way. And then I might also draw on stories I've heard, anecdotes, things I read in the news, or images from films, images from fiction. So it's always kind of a concoction of those things. But yeah, I definitely, to speak broadly about it, I had a couple experiences during my undergrad that were especially distressing. These kinds of moments of these encounters that revealed something I wasn't conscious of beforehand, and I tried to process that through my fiction, as I do with all of my traumas, micro and macro. That's my job as a horror writer, I guess, is and then relay them to somebody else.
Yeah.
That's my line of work.
The funny thing about horror is it tends to focus on the negative things in life, and there being monsters that are killing people is the very basic idea of what horror is. Of course, you're gonna focus on that, but you mentioned in your notes a lot about pessimism, and of course the philosophy or pessimistic philosophies. But I was wondering if it's possible at all. Do you think it's possible at all to turn that on its head and use? Is there such thing as like a more positive philosophy that you could base horror on? Would that work? Would that even be interesting?
I mean, I think it's been done. I think Ray Bradbury and Stephen King, to a large degree, are often quite optimistic in their resolutions. That's not to say their work is without its fair share of darkness, but I think they find a kind of ultimate a grounds for optimism in their fiction. I think there's like a wide spectrum of worldviews within the horror genre. At its simplest form, I guess it's a matter of asking, are the monsters defeated at the end, or is normalcy restored? Sometimes it's a question of, is normal worthy of restoration, or should we strive for something better? I'm actually interested in a kind of positivist pessimism, which again sounds like a paradox, but I wrote in my thesis this term called exuberant demontology. And demontology is a study of nothing, but a kind of productivity out of nothingness, or generating negative knowledge that can be a kind of positivity. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's something I've been exploring for a while. And I don't know if I've resolved anything on that front, but
that sounds like it would be quite difficult to resolve, honestly.
Yeah.
Because you'd go into like many metaphysical things, because there's people, like even me, sometimes it just seems like the universe has it in for you, like earlier with my headphones issue.
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to this interview all week, and then my headphones die on me and it screws up the whole thing, right? Seems like there's this cosmic joke that's continuously coming after you. Do you find that at all?
Yeah, that's Yog-Sothoth fucking with us. Just Yog-Sothoth being all petty today.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's and I mean, my pessimism, I think it stems both from my philosophical and my aesthetic interests, but also just from lifelong challenges with depression. And it's hard to know, what comes from a mental narrative affiliated with that disorder, and what of it is just an actual access to the reality of things. But so that's I'm always grappling with pessimism for sure.
Yeah, I think it's good too. Honestly, I think if you lean either one way or the other too much, it can damage you.
Mm-hmm.
For the author's notes for Mired, you discussed the need you had to write something a little more lighthearted, or at least funny, comedic. But I found, honestly, while reading through your stories in this in this collection, that a lot of your stories actually have at least a little bit of comedy in them. Do you surprise yourself while you're writing when the story, maybe you envisioned it as being completely dark and dreadful? Do you ever surprise yourself that the story actually came out with a bit of comedy in it?
Honestly, I'm glad you bring up the comedy, because it shows me that there are other, freaks like me out there. I think I have a really twisted sense of humor. Yeah, I agree. I think, to me, most of my fiction is kind of funny to some degree, but you never know if that comes through to all readers. But yeah, I think, while I have quote unquote serious goals in mind when I'm setting out to write something, I also I think I have a sense of humor, and I hope that finds its way into the fiction. I think it's just organically always there. I do have a very dark sense of humor, so I think it's just it's just endemic to the work in some sense.
Yeah, maybe it's possible that I found things comedic, or maybe found the comedic nuggets in certain places where others wouldn't. Others might be like, "Oh, that was horrible," and I'm like,
one of us
Yeah.
will gobble.
But speaking of like comedy and tragedy, because they often go together very well, and can you explain why that is?
I suppose that probably comes back to this idea of contingency, or disorder, just the nature of existence. It's chaotic and it's unpredictable and it fluctuates, and sometimes something really horrible will happen, and there's there'll be a happy song playing on the radio, and it leads to this kind of ironic dissonance. When I was writing the conclusion to the story Long Man in this collection, for some reason I had Cher's song Believe looping in my head, which I was like, this is so fucked up, but it's also kind of weirdly funny.
Yeah.
So I worked that into the story. Sometimes even just that dissonance can cause us to laugh, just the discomfort of it.
Yeah, I remember getting a good chuckle when I read that at the end of that story, that you had that song stuck in your head, and you're like, I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't know. Can't explain it.
The Long Man was actually another favorite of mine from this. It had one of the freakiest scenes I've ever read near the end there. I'm not going to say what it was, but you probably have an idea what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I read it while I was at work, and I had to give myself like a physical shake, because I did not see that coming at all. And it was just, oh my God, So this story, along with Remembering Absence, these stories are related. You wouldn't know it just without reading the author's notes at all, but they are related in that they are the result of what was a failed novel, right? I was wondering, what was the novel about exactly, and how did it fail?
Yeah, so it was a really ambitious idea. I wanted to write a kind of road novel that was also a kind of investigation from the perspective of a ghost. So the protagonist of Remembering Absence was the protagonist of the novel, trying to resolve the mystery behind the unexpected death of his cousin Jonah, who is alluded to throughout Long Man. And yeah, it was going to be this kind of road novel across Canada, the ghost wandering from place to place, kind of stopping in at these destitute places that his cousin had frequented. His cousin kind of fell into a bad, dark place, and the ghost just wanted to find out what happened. And ultimately, Longman was involved in the mystery. I didn't have all the plot threads resolved. I had a lot of notes for it. The earlier draft of Longman that I submitted to Creepy Campfire Stories for Grown-Ups was called In the Locust Furnace. It was named after a Godflesh song. And yeah, there was this sequence where the ghost was surveying this motley crew of guys in a basement, having a conversation that alluded to Jonah, and the ghost kind of trying to read their facial expressions by getting as close as he could. But ultimately, the editor said, I don't really care about all of that stuff. I just want to know more about the Long Man. Can you write a story that's sort of like the backstory of the Long Man? So it turned into a standalone kind of urban legend thing. Yeah, that's where that came from. And then Remembering Absence also ended up just becoming its own piece too.
Yeah, they're both quite beautiful stories. Well, the second one is a beautiful story. It actually gave me a bit of an emotional reaction. I read it last night before going to bed, and I really enjoyed it. Building on the last question, though, I noticed from your notes and in interviews that your intention is often to write really big artistic or pieces of artistic literature, and then you backtrack, it seems to me, and come out with something that's just maybe just a little more reader friendly. Is there a reason why that happens? Why haven't you written like the big experimental novel?
Maybe I will write outside of the genre eventually. I think I often just end up submitting to my darkest impulses, just because I'm such a big fan of the horror genre. So I think usually what I'm striving to do is draw on, like I said, my interest in this broad spectrum of both quote high and low art, and trying to bridge that. So trying to create something that I would love to read as somebody who, adores Virginia Woolf as much as I adore splatterpunk fiction. Again, I think maybe hopefully that creates some interesting dissonance in my work. Maybe that novel could have been more quote unquote literary. I mean, I was at the time taking a James Joyce seminar, which I mentioned in my author notes. And I think that was actually what motivated me to want to write from the perspective of a ghost. I wanted the opportunity to write in this really freewheeling, free associative prose style. I just couldn't figure out, like, technically how to write a novel from the perspective of a character with no agency. I just couldn't seem to resolve it.
Do you see yourself doing that one day, though?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I'm totally open to it. I think I'll write anything, whatever the muse guides me to write. So I'm starting my PhD in creative writing in the fall, and for that program, I'll need to complete either a novel or a collection of short stories. And with she's a scholar of William Blake and the Gothic tradition, as well as pessimistic philosophy. So, I'm kind of thinking, if this is where things lead me, it could be interesting to write something within the Gothic tradition, but who knows?
It'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. I hope you publish a lot of that.
Fingers crossed. That's always the hope. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have any weird writing rituals or superstitions.
I am like the most boring person when it comes to my writing rituals. I've had people ask, and I try to come up with the most grotesque, arcane ritual.
So there's no goat slaughtering or drinking.
No, man, I'm vegan. I'm vegan, so I can't even make that up. And I don't think vegans can sacrifice humans either. That seems hypocritical. Yeah. So no, I just I use my fingers and I hit the keys on the keyboard, and things happen. Sometimes I'll listen to music when I write. I guess this might be the most interesting thing. When I'm first drafting a story, I'll either listen to music that's really minimalist and sparse, like ambient and drone music, or something that's really, really heavy. So like black metal or grindcore or death metal, as long as the lyrics aren't intelligible. So
Yeah. Do you find that influences, like if you're listening to a piece of music, do you find that influences, or the music itself influences the tone of the story at all?
it might well influence the tone. But I think more than anything, what I'm using the music to do is drown out all the external noise, the people screaming on the street and the motorcycles and things like that. So more than anything, it's just there for utilitarian purposes.
Yeah. You did an author spotlight for Dark Between Pages, Nikki's channel. And I believe it was there anyway. You said that it took you a few years to write Shelter for the Damned. Were there periods while writing it where you just abandoned the whole thing until you felt comfortable to pick it back up again?
Yeah, absolutely. That book was a long process that took many different forms. I've talked about this in a lot of interviews, but for a while it was written as basically like an epic prose poem. It had no punctuation aside from commas and slashes. And I had these concrete poetry sections where the shack was kind of summoning itself out of commas and slashes. I was too liberally influenced by Hubert Selby Jr., I think, at that point. So and then there were a few points where the book just sat in a box for sometimes a year at a time, and then I would come back to it. And eventually, I decided to reimagine it as a more conventionally formatted novel, with the, I think, wise suggestions of one of my mentors, Randy Schroeder, who wrote a great book called Arctic Smoke. Yeah.
Very cool. In one of the author's notes for Darkest Hours, you mentioned imposter syndrome and anxiety. How big of a role has that played in your writing? And do you still suffer from those?
Big time. Yeah. I have that infamous triple threat that plagues a lot of people, I think, in the academic world, and probably people all over, which is anxiety, imposter syndrome, and depression. Depression is the most persistent of the three, the loudest, the toughest to fight. And I primarily use my fiction as a defensive process, or a cathartic or a therapeutic process. So I'm not so much thinking about offending the reader, although I'm sure some of my fiction could be qualified as offensive. It's more about defending myself, exorcising myself of the things that scare me and the things that hurt me. So my fiction is usually an effort to ward off those things. But yeah, ongoing. It's an ongoing process, like lifelong, for sure.
I've heard artists actually talk about, musicians and writers talk about, using that well of hurt especially from your earlier life, because that's when you're most impressionable. But I was wondering if with what you just said, do you ever fear, like maybe not fear, but do you have any idea of where you might go if that well runs dry? The hurt?
Yeah. It's interesting, actually. I was having a conversation with a therapist a few months ago about this. She said, it seems like, you've experienced a lot of anger and hurt and pain in the past, and she was noticing that I was, making some progress. And she asked me that very question. She said, and she said, in real life, you're a fairly gentle, kind, easygoing person. And she gave me a term that was something like strategic dissociation. And it's similar to what therapists do. So when therapists enter the office to engage with a client, they're not, they're in a sense dissociating, because if they fully, I guess, submitted to whatever emotional baggage or excess is happening in that office, it would be exhausting. They couldn't function in the real world. So I think as a writer, that's similarly what I need to do, is to When I'm writing, find the means to tap into that place, but when I'm not writing, be relieved of it. That's the ultimate goal. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah.
yeah.
Is there anything that you do, like, how do you overcome the process of depression and anxiety, and especially imposter syndrome?
I mean, like I said, it's an ongoing process. For me, I find it helps to have a daily practice of meditation. I haven't been great at that recently. I take medication, and I'm trying to figure out the right dosage for me. Not everybody finds that works for them, but I'm open to whatever. And therapy, leaning on friends and family, eating properly, sleep, diet, and exercise, all those usual things. So it's a lot, but it's a matter of just trying to stay on top of it, trying to be conscious of where I'm at any given moment. Yeah, so it's a process.
What makes you come back? Like, let's just say you dropped Shelter for the Damned. You're like, this is just too much. I can't do it right now. And you drop it for like 6 months to a year, we'll just say. What makes you go back to it?
I think sometimes it's just it's a matter of like what sticks, what keeps nagging at you. So somewhere in your brain, there's this voice saying you should go back to that. There's something there. And in the case of Shelter for the Damned, I knew that was a story that was important to me to complete and to get out there in the world. I don't know if you ever feel that something is finished. I certainly don't. You can only define it as finished once it's out there in the world. So at some point you have to say, okay, this is finished enough to send out. So that's an ongoing process too, determining when and how you know that something is done.
Yeah.
Or as done as it will get.
Mark asks, how did you come up with the title for this collection? Because, it's a good question. I don't think there's a story called Darkest Hours in there, unless I'm mistaken.
No, there isn't. Yeah, it's not a phrase in the collection either. Thank you, Mark. I guess the title is probably a tribute to some of Stephen King's short story collection and novella collection names, like 4 Past Midnight, Night Shift, Just After Sunset, Full Dark, No Stars. It was probably, I think, to some degree influenced by those titles. I wanted something that captured that spirit. And also, so the title has a double function. I think it's best read during the darkest hours, but then it also reflects a lot of people who are, experiencing their own darkest hours. They're at their lowest point or at their most horrifying point in their lives. So yeah, I guess it has a dual meaning there.
Mark he's pretty prolific. I asked him when he was on the show, probably both times too, how many collections he has out, and it's quite a bit. He comes up with really great names for his his collections too.
Yeah, he's so talented. I read one of his stories in a Halloween anthology a few years ago, and I loved it. And he's perennially on my queue of more. I need to read more of his work. But yeah, very talented guy.
Now your novel, Shelter for the Damned, I have to say that novel really made me squirm in a lot of different places because it's very tense. Mm-hmm. Like this book, like I said, I think part of it is because I was looking at it. It would have been interesting to see my reaction had I read it 10 years ago before I had a kid.
Yeah.
To now, because like we were talking about before, I was like looking at it from the parents' angle, but the story really almost has, well, I wouldn't say it has nothing to do with the parents, but the parents are like in the background, right? And they often create some of the circumstances that we find these kids in. But I was wondering, how were you able to create and maintain that sense of intensity? Oh,
thanks. I'm glad to hear that that came across. I think as long as you're writing from a real place, hopefully some of the residue of that affect and that experience will find its way into the fiction. So, as someone who has dealt with anxiety, as someone who did get into a lot of trouble in my teenage years, did spend a lot of time in the principal's office, did get suspended, didn't seem to find a way out of that cycle. I knew some of those feelings, so I drew on that. What did that feel like? And you just, you dig deep into your reservoir and try to translate that into fiction. And then also, like I said, just studying other writers. So in this case, the psychological interiority of novelists like Hubert Selby Jr. and Jim Thompson was hugely instructive for me. The way those writers depict people who are consumed by their demons to some extent. And I think that's also true of Poe. And of course, Stephen King is a huge influence. The way he writes about teenage experience and teenage subjectivity is always so vivid and real, I find. So, yeah,
totally. Like the one thing I really enjoy about learning about the influences of certain stories of yours is that you say it, and I'm like, except for the cipher was the only one that really, like, I thought of the cipher while I was reading that story that was influenced by it, but none of the others I caught on. You know what I mean? And so it was interesting to see that. And Jim Thompson, again, talking about him, I absolutely love his prose. And there were instances after I learned about the Jim Thompson influence, I looked back and I was like, yeah, you know what? There's a lot of things in there that correlate. You can see the influence there, but I didn't pick up on it at first. But yeah, very awesome job on that.
Thank you.
I read Shelter for the... You sent me a free copy for Darkest Hours, and thank you for that. I read it and loved it. But before reading it, I bought a copy of Shelter for the Damned, and I read it. And like I said, man, I wasn't sure for a little while there if I was going to be able to finish it because it's dealing with kids, and ever since I've had my son, I have trouble reading about dangerous things happening to kids. And I find that all your fiction that I've read at least has a lot of that. But I was able to finish it, and I quite enjoyed my journey. It's almost as though you're like, come, we're going to go on a dark little ride here, but don't worry, I won't completely fuck you up.
Hopefully not. I want everybody to have a happy and full life.
Yeah. The ending of course, I'm not going to go into what happens at the end for Shelter for the Damned, but I really, as a big fan of cosmic horror and weird fiction, I really appreciated that you went there. And I kind of have a question about the mechanics of writing that, because within my own writing, I want to sort of capture stuff like that. And I'm sure other people do as well. So what happens at the end, it gets very weird. And yet it almost doesn't make any sense. If you look at what's going on outside the box, it doesn't make any sense. But then when you think about it, you're like, no, this is actually following a pattern and everything else there. It does make sense if you think about it. How did you capture that, man?
Well, thank you again. I think for me as a writer, the most fun I have is going to those really psychedelic, otherworldly places. So I just, I had a sense of where the novel was going. I knew the shack was some kind of portal, some kind of cosmic entity. And I knew that eventually it would open itself up to Mark, so to speak. So I just tap into my imagination and kind of allow it to guide me. And again, another influence in terms of the imagery there. I mean, the weird tradition in general, I'm hugely influenced by, especially H.P. Lovecraft. but also people like Algernon Blackwood and William Hope Hodgson. So you just do your homework, and also hopefully you have the machinery to be able to go there yourself. So I just tapped into my imagination and just went with it, and allowed it to guide me into psychedelic places.
Speaking of H.P. Lovecraft, going back to Darkest Hours here, I noticed that a lot of characters had H.P. Lovecraft character names. Like there's a Randolph. Oh, you know what? I can't remember any others. Was that intentional at all?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I try to have little shout outs and homages,
little Easter eggs and that.
Yeah, for sure.
I had a lot of fun. Like every time I came across something like that, I was like, "Oh, hey," it was awesome. So, in my own anxiety, because I put that question out, or at least a call to action for people to ask questions for this interview, I was talking to Nikki about this, and I was like, "Do you have any questions that you didn't get to ask in your author profile with him?" And she did send me a couple here, and they're actually really good questions. She wants to know what's your favorite parts of the publishing process?
My favorite part of the publishing process? I think the most gratifying is just seeing the completed book, just seeing it actualized as an object in the world, and engaging with readers, and that's for me. Yeah, so once the book exists in the world and being able to talk to folks who have read the work and engage with the work, that's my favorite part. Yeah, I'd have to say that's where I get the most pleasure.
If Shelter for the Damned was adapted to a film, who would you have? She asks, who would you cast as the characters? But I'm going to change it a bit. I want to know, who would you have direct it?
That's a really interesting question, because I'm actually, I've finished working on a treatment of Shelter for the Damned, which is essentially a blueprint for a screenplay. And I've been in talks with the great Jamie Blanks, who has become a dear friend of mine. He directed Urban Legend, Valentine, Storm Warning, and Long Weekend. So Jamie would be, my first pick. He and I are dead set on collaborating on something together. And in terms of casting, it would just have to be an incredible actor for Mark. I think we would have to cast the net far and wide and just find the best actor. I don't know many young actors out there, so it might be someone we've never seen before. But
that would be hard to pick, because there's a lot of kids in it, and and I don't really pay too much attention to because they usually don't stick, the children actors. But yeah, you never know, right? If hang on here, are your friends and family supportive of your writing career?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm very fortunate and grateful. And I have a lot of friends who are also writers, which is always great. I meet regularly with two Calgary writers named Neil Howell and the aforementioned Randy Nickel Schroeder. We talk a lot about process and genre. And I just caught up last month with another friend of mine, Erin Emily Ann Vance. She's a phenomenal poet and writer. And I haven't spoken to him in a while, but Josh Whitehead, so I know lots of writer folks who get the process, and they're fun to talk to on that front. And yeah, the family is definitely supportive.
Do you have anyone who would try to talk you down or tell you can't do it? And if you do, what do you do to counteract that?
I think like out of the best intentions, sometimes people advise you to have a backup plan or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but I just was like, well, I can't do something that I don't give a shit about. I'm not about to do that. So, my quote unquote backup plan, my day job is teaching, and that's kind of bound up in my love of reading and writing, and I happen to love teaching as well. So that hasn't been an issue. I've managed to survive without giving anyone any grief. So so far so good.
Oh, one more by Nikki. Do you write for yourself, or do you have an audience in mind?
I feel like I can't have an audience in mind when I write. It's just not the way I operate.
Mm-hmm.
I have to write from a real, authentic place, and in order to make any movement on my work, I have to just shut all of that out. What would this kind of reader think? Would it fit into this shelf at the bookstore or whatever? I can't even entertain those ideas while I'm writing. All that stuff, you can sort out after you've written and rewritten and drafted and edited and all of that.
Yeah.
All
right. So if anyone has any questions, I only have a few more myself. So please feel free to ask, and we will get to them. And if you asked one before that wasn't answered, it might have been during our issues, or I might have missed it because there's a while there the comments were going pretty quick. So please ask again. I want to move into a little bit of discussion in regards to the movie essays at the end of Darkest Hours, because I absolutely love watching movies myself. I've watched horror movies for like decades, Oh, yeah. And so reading through your essays, which I did today before the interview, I was so happy because you bring up a lot of things that generally piss me off because people have negative things to say about it. But you went on to praise this stuff. And one of those things is Rob Zombie movies. I don't know how many, anytime Rob Zombie comes out with a new movie on social media, like Facebook and Twitter, all the horror writers come out to completely shit all over it. And I was wondering, I love Rob Zombie films.
Yeah,
they are so dark. They're so well done. Like, you go into a lot of technical details in the Rob Zombie films. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you have an opinion as to why people seem to not take to his stuff. I think honestly, he's going to be remembered after he's gone, and his films are going to be classics. That's the way I think, right? Like, because most of these directors who are genius, I think Rob Zombie might be genius.
Yeah.
They're often not appreciated while they're here and doing the work. So why do you think people don't take to him?
Well, that's a very good question. I think his work is combative. It makes no apologies. And I think that might bother people. He doesn't seem to succumb to or adhere to trends, what's popular in horror cinema right now. I think he just makes the kind of work that speaks to him and that interests him, and that's what I happen to love about his work. But yeah, his films are often ugly and abrasive and uncomfortable. I will never scrub that long motel sequence from The Devil's Rejects from my memory, where they're torturing the family. But I think it's very carefully and artistically executed. So yeah, I have no idea. I think he's brilliant too. My favorite is probably The Lords of Salem, but I like just about everything he's done. And I grew up listening to his music. I had a copy of Hellbilly Deluxe on steady rotation in my Discman back in junior high. So,
have you seen him live?
Yeah, I saw him a couple years ago. Have you seen him live? He's
the show is so big. There's flames and people in costumes, and it's incredible.
Yeah, he's very much in the tradition of Alice Cooper, I think. Yeah,
very much so.
Yeah, who I also love, of course.
Actually, the first time I saw Rob Zombie live, they were playing with a band I think you were making fun of in one of your stories here, but you didn't name them. Okay. And that was Korn.
Oh, I love Korn.
I think you were still making fun of them though, because there's references to new metal and the brother opens up the door and all you hear is why.
Yeah.
I thought of Corn, and I had a good laugh at that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. No shade though. I love Corn. They got me through my tough teenage years and
for sure. I love them too. I am also like I know you're a fellow metalhead.
Yeah,
and I am too. And Korn holds a real special place in my heart, especially their earlier stuff. Their first 3 albums, they got me through some like really dark times. And you're right, they're so good. They created a subgenre, right? So
totally. Yeah, I mean, like absolutely, new metal. That's like they're the template for that.
Yeah, but you can still like poke fun at them and get a little, you know.
Yeah. I mean, Kate in the auteur takes a jab at Bride of Chucky, and I love Bride of Chucky. So
you mentioned that, yeah, for sure. I found that your voice, as it would, obviously, your voice changes when you're doing the more academic papers. I was wondering how you find that voice when you're writing more critical essays, especially on the movies.
Probably just comes from all the essays I've had to write for classes. So I just naturally slip into that mode when I'm writing critical work. And I see Michael just shouted out Burzum.
Yeah,
Dark Throne. Good shit.
Yeah. These people are after my own heart right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Bathory is probably my favorite black metal.
Satyricon there. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
I was also appreciative of your essay on Toby Hooper. I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves. I think he's going to be another one of those who goes down in history as like one of the masters. He's considered a master, obviously, while he was here. I mean, he did Masters of Horror, right? But most people, when they're talking about horror movie directors, they don't talk about Toby Hooper. What gives?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the only film of his that has been given its due, really, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There have been some, I think, since debunked myths that he didn't actually direct Poltergeist. That's long been disproven. But actually, I was really honored and happy to be able to contribute an essay to an anthology that just came out through the University of Texas Press called American Twilight. And it's a really comprehensive, peer-reviewed study, tons of scholars writing on basically all of Hooper's films. Like, when they asked me, they said, we only have a couple titles left to touch on, and I ended up writing on Crocodile and Eaten Alive. So esoteric films that aren't normally discussed. So I'm glad that book
is out. They're exceptionally hard to find too these days.
Yeah, for sure. I see Rob Shepard just shouted out Alice Cooper. Yes, Alice Cooper is the GOAT. The best.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Do you write in any other medium? I mean, mostly you do the critique for horror movies and you write fiction. Do you write, I mean, being a music fan, do you write music critique too? Or would you?
I have written some essays on music. Yeah, I wrote a piece on Alice Cooper. I wrote a piece on Judas Priest's Screaming for Vengeance for In Review Online. I wrote a piece on actually the Korn album Untouchables as well. So yeah, I've written some stuff on music, and I think I reviewed a couple Sun Kill Moon albums. And I started writing poetry in my early 20s. I'm not terribly happy with a lot of that stuff. I've considered going back to poetry at some point, maybe doing a poetry collection, but I haven't done that in a while.
Yeah, I used to write poetry too, but there were more like really bad song lyrics.
Yeah, I think most of that stuff would make me cringe now, but yeah.
Got a question here from Dana. She says, my daughter Jordan is 12 and she is writing her first horror story. When did you find that first spooky story?
Oh, good question. Happy to hear your little one is entering that world, Dana. That's awesome. I probably wrote my first scary story when I was like, I think I was 6, probably. I just remember I was digging through a box of old stuff the other day, and I saw there was a stack of ghost-shaped paper. It must have been like a first grade class assignment. And I wrote a story that ended with someone being stabbed by a ghost's knife, and I spelt knife without a K at the beginning. So that's that's the first one I could find. So.
Did you? I used to write these comics that were probably would have got me in a lot of trouble had the teachers found them, because they were. I called it Mad Max, and it was like just this blob of a guy who went around with a knife stabbing people, and I was like 6 or 7 years old. And I don't know what the hell I was writing or why I was writing that, but when I think back on it, but did you write anything like that?
For sure. Actually, I remember one story that did get me in trouble. There was a family of alligators, like humanoid alligators, that were about to board a bus, and the bus driver, also a humanoid alligator, was like shit-faced. And there were like cans of beer rolling all over the bus. And my teacher wrote a note saying, like, the story is well written, but I don't think this is appropriate for the class. I don't know what, like, my parents didn't drink at all. So I don't know where that came from, but yeah.
That reminds me, actually, in art class in high school, we had to do like calligraphy, right? And we had to choose like song lyrics to do it. So I chose a Guns N' Roses song, "Sick of This Life, Not That You Care. I'm not the only one with whom these feelings I share." And I got a slip into my locker from the guidance counselor because of that. Wow. I had to go talk to the guidance, and they didn't even approach me personally. They put a slip into my locker. And so I had to go down and talk to them, and they had it there. And they're like, is there something you need to talk about? And I'm like, no, I like that. It's a song.
Yeah.
I like the song.
Yeah. Oh my God. That actually just reminds me, there was an elementary school assignment. I went to Catholic school, and they were doing a wall where all of us were supposed to draw our image of God for this wall. And I drew this sentient pyramid with red eyes and a fanged mouth, with blood spilling out, and it was just sitting on this pool of blood. And this surrounded by all these images of like dudes with beards and rainbows. There was this like horrific, and they just put it on the wall. No one, maybe they were too scared to ask me. It's like, that's your image of God? So
what's wrong with you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, so I think that's it for the questions.
Good note to end on.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm gonna end. Wait here. Speaking of here, I'm gonna put this up just in case. Speaking of Jordan, when she was 8, she told her teacher her dad wasn't around because he got offed in the second Jason movie. True story. I received a phone call.
Wow, Jordan sounds like she's going to grow up to be an amazing woman. Fantastic, I love it,
and a great writer too, I think.
Yes, yeah, one of us.
Yes. All right, so I'm going to end this. I want to thank you, and thank you for putting up with my stupid headphones that died on me. No problem. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get these 2 videos together. And I'm going to like edit them and then just splice it into one and then re-release it. And so that people don't get confused as like, why is there a part 1 and a part 2? So yeah, I'll fix it up. And thanks everyone for coming out. I truly appreciate your questions and your comments. That was awesome. And thanks again, Mike. And you're coming out with a new collection this fall. I'm hoping that you're willing to come on again, and maybe we'll have a proper conversation.
I'd love to, man. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everybody who turned up to make comments and ask questions. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dana.